Hello, and welcome everybody to this event, 200 Words to Protect the Planet. I'm Jojo Mehta. I'm co-founder and director of the global campaign Stop Ecocide International and chair of our charitable NGO, the Stop Ecocide Foundation, which is hosting this event today. And I'm here with two amazing guests as part of London's Climate Action Week to talk about a new and a potentially very powerful legal tool for addressing the climate and ecological crises. And that is a possible new international crime of ecocide, a legal intervention at the highest level, which could put severe damage to the natural world on a par with genocide and crimes against humanity. A top independent panel of international criminal and environmental lawyers convened by our foundation has spent the last 6 months drafting a concise legal definition for this potential international crime. It's a definition which was launched last week into the public domain and has already generated over 100 major media stories around the globe, from the Financial Times to the UN Environment Programme. And before we dive in with introductions and a bit of background to today's conversation, a little Zoom housekeeping, which many of you will be familiar with. Feel free to use the chat box to say where you're tuning in from and to converse with each other. But if you want to ask questions, we will come to that in the latter half of the session. Please put your questions not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And there is a little like button in there, which you can use to upvote the questions that you like. So please do this, because we'd like to address both a variety of questions, but also to focus on the most popular ones, because it's unlikely we will get to everything. So let me introduce our guests in this conversation. I'm joined today by two lawyers, actually, both barristers. And the first to speak, once we've set the scene a little, will be Richard Rogers. Richard is a UK and a US qualified lawyer. He's been working in the area of international criminal law for over 20 years, initially as a United Nations lawyer at the war crimes tribunals in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and Cambodia. More recently, as a private lawyer through his law firm, Global Diligence, and his NGO, Climate Council. He was co-deputy chair of the Ecocide drafting panel, and Richard will be telling us about what it was like to engage in this work and talking us through the new legal definition. I'll then be bringing in our other guest for today, who is a Londoner, also a barrister, but better known as one of the UK's most admired and principled politicians. He is, of course, the Right Honourable David Lammy, long-standing Labour MP for Tottenham. David has held a number of government positions in the past, including Minister for Culture, Minister for Higher Education, and now he's joining his political and legal backgrounds together in his current role as Shadow Justice Minister. And we'll be asking David why the political world should be taking this law seriously. But first, I will begin with a little bit of background on where we have come to today with this whole initiative. So when the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the International Criminal Court, when that document was first being drafted, there was an intention in the draft code that became that document and that governs the International Criminal Court. There was originally a clause to include serious damage to the environment as an international crime. That clause never made it to the final cut. And so the international crimes that were brought into being with the Rome Statute in 1998 and the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002 were genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. More recently, the crime of aggression has been amended and added to that statute. So serious crimes against the environment have not, until now, held that same status, and neither have they been condemned in the same way. And this was discovered by a UK lawyer, a visionary barrister by the name of Polly Higgins, with whom I worked very closely, who was looking for a legal duty of care for the planet. How could we go about creating that? And she discovered that the Rome Statute had originally intended to include environmental damage. And she put two and two together and realized that criminal law is protective law. Effectively, your right to life is protected by the fact that to murder you is a crime. And so the best way to protect the planet was going to be to bring in a criminal law. And she dedicated the last 10 years of her life to promoting that concept. 4.5 of those years, I worked closely with her, and we co-founded the Stop Ecocide campaign back in 2017. And that is a campaign that is gathering huge momentum at present. What has changed? Well, the world is becoming increasingly awake to and realizing the seriousness of the climate and environmental crisis, and realizing that if we continue business as usual, we are heading towards a kind of a cliff edge. We've also seen huge mobilizations at the grassroots level, from the school strikes inspired by Greta Thunberg to Extinction Rebellion, with their disruptive and polarizing actions, which have opened the media window to allow this conversation to really land, and the political world to sit up and take notice. And in that context, the concept of criminalizing ecocide has gathered momentum in a major way. And we're now in discussion with many states and governments around the world, as well as people in many different walks of life and corporate sectors. We have campaign teams in 15 countries, and this conversation continues to grow. But a question kept returning over the years: what exactly do you mean by ecocide? And last year, parliamentarians from Sweden approached us. And this is a kind of symptom of the political appetite that's been growing. And what they said to us is, this is clearly your area of expertise. You've been working in this area for several years. Would you be able to commission a definition, a legal definition of ecocide that could actually be proposed potentially by states at the International Criminal Court? And in response to that request, we were able to draw together a panel of top international criminal lawyers and environmental lawyers from around the world to create an independent expert panel to work on this definition. And that is what they did over the last 6 months, bringing together precedent from international law and environmental law, and a huge variety of backgrounds and experience that they brought to that panel. And Richard Rogers was deputy co-chair of that panel and has been there through all of that drafting process. And I'd like to welcome Richard now to introduce us to the work of the panel and to the definition as it has emerged. Richard, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jojo, for inviting me. And I'll start with some background for those who haven't been involved in war crimes or genocide. That's probably most of you. The Rome Statute is basically an international treaty that created the ICC, and it contains the 4 international crimes that Jojo mentioned. So genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. And all those 4 grew from the ashes of the Second World War and reflected the international community's disgust and condemnation at the excessive bombing, the intentional targeting of civilians, and of course the attempted annihilation of an entire group of people. And the hope was that those 4 crimes would help prevent similar atrocities in the future. And so that's where we stand today. Basically, we have 4 crimes, and there's been no new one since, which sort of suggests how difficult it is to create a new international crime. So where might ecocide fit into that framework? Well, some say, do we even need to update the focus of the international community's collective condemnation? Today is very different from 1945, when the world was in tatters, but in many ways, the situation is no less urgent in terms of the need for behavioral change. So our cities may not be bombed out, but we now face catastrophe if we don't stop the destruction of the natural environment. So there really is an imminent threat to the global peace and security, and that should be of concern to the International Criminal Court. So one may ask, can't we use those 4 existing international crimes to tackle environmental destruction? Well, to some extent we can, in some cases. They cast a very wide net. War crimes sets the legal parameters of conduct during war. Crimes against humanity can be used also in peacetime. Genocide is there if a specific group of people is targeted for destruction. But what they all have in common is a major limitation, which is that the prosecution must also prove serious human harm. And therein lies the problem. There's not a single provision in the ICC statute at the moment which protects nature in and of itself. So if we have a situation of massive environmental destruction, but we cannot prove associated human harm, or, and this is very relevant, we cannot show that the human harm is direct enough, so there's a problem of causation, then the destruction won't fall under the current crimes. And that's a real value of having a new crime of ecocide, that it would give nature its own standing, irrespective of humans. Of course, adding a new crime is not going to be easy. States are understandably very cautious about new international crimes which will bind them. Some leaders may be worried about their own liability. If you're the Prime Minister of Cambodia, for example, others may be worried about how it would undermine their economies. But there are so many justifications for a new crime of ecocide. And I think we don't need to look further than the ICC's preamble, which is basically the section of the Rome Statute which introduces the crime and gives the overall rationale. Because it was a really extraordinary exercise in creating the world's first criminal court. And there's a lot of paragraphs, but I'll just quote a couple of them, which I think are highly relevant. First, and I quote, that the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole must not go unpunished. And second, that grave crimes threaten the peace, security, and well-being of the world. So is massive environmental destruction a serious crime of international concern? Well, of course it is. And considering the existential threat that it poses, there can hardly be a more serious crime. And secondly, does climate change and biodiversity loss threaten the peace, security, and well-being? Yes, it does. I'll give you one example, and that's Sudan, where global warming caused drought. Drought led to groups coming in contact and competing for fertile land, and then conflict started on a local scale, and it ended up in genocide. And in fact, the UN Secretary General has referred to that as the first climate war. Some commentators suggest that Syria was also, the Syrian war was affected by climate change, but in any event, there's certainly going to be many, many more. So, so yes, basically, the most serious crimes of environmental destruction absolutely belong in the Rome Statute, and it's never been more timely, nor has it been more urgent. So that's why Jojo and her foundation set up this panel to formulate a rigorous and hopefully acceptable definition of ecocide. And it was released last week, and I'll just read it out to you. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So remember, it's only the most serious cases of environmental destruction that we're interested in, the same as other types of international crime. And that's why there are two thresholds. The first one deals with the scale and nature of the harm. So it must be severe and either widespread or long-term. And the second one deals with the types of acts. So it's either unlawful, so it's already been prohibited by a state or all states. And the second is wanton. And wanton is important here because it means the reckless disregard for damage which would be clearly excessive in relation to the social and economic benefits anticipated. And wanton would allow a court to weigh the costs with the benefits. And that's important because, unfortunately, there are legitimate processes of development, roads, airports, housing, etc., which do cause severe damage to the environment, but they are needed, particularly in developing countries. So who might be caught if a new crime of ecocide is adopted? Well, the ICC can only try natural persons, so individuals. It cannot prosecute states and it cannot prosecute corporations, but it can prosecute heads of states, kings, queens, heads of corporations. There is none of this head of state immunity that applies in national court systems. So it can be very wide. And not only can it target those who directly committed the crimes, but it can also target those who solicit, who induce, who aid and abet, those who make the policies, those who finance, etc. So it can target a whole range of actors within a criminal system. Now, of course, international criminal law can only be one piece of the puzzle. We're in this process of major transition, and what we really need is a change of attitude and behavior. And criminal law has always been one of the most effective tools that society has to influence behavior. It sets the parameters of what is and what is not acceptable. And when that law is an international law, an international crime, it sends a particularly powerful message. And we believe that it can have very serious impact in terms of promoting a new social conscience, because the weight of condemnation is so huge, and nobody wants to be prosecuted and seen as equivalent to a war criminal. So a new crime of ecocide is needed, it's justified, and it really could make a meaningful difference to the fight against climate change and biodiversity loss. And I hope that you can all support it in any way you can. Thank you, Jojo.
Thanks, Richard, so much for that incredibly concise and clear explanation of the need for ecocide, and also the summary of the definition that has just emerged. I'd like to move to David Lammy now, actually. David, could you just give us your thoughts on, firstly, maybe what was your first reaction when you first heard about the potential for a crime of ecocide, and then maybe, you know, why is it that politicians should be taking note of this and getting behind this at this time?
Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me. I think that we have to look at ecocide in the context of the moment. And this is a critical and important and hugely unusual moment. And what I mean by that is, in this last year, what has been the sort of two central movements of our time and concerns of our time. One, of course, is the pandemic that we're all caught up in. And therefore the inequality that we see before us as a result of that pandemic. By that I mean, who is dying in countries around the world? What do those people look like? They're largely black and brown people, and they're certainly poor people. Why have we got that pandemic? Many would say, those who are nautic specialists, that it has a lot to do with disruption of biodiversity that has put us in this position in the first place. And the second thing is, the only other major interruption to the moment has been the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And it's those two things that combine to give us this moment where we are moving from a conversation about the environment and about the climate emergency and climate breakdown to a conversation that is about climate justice. And climate justice forces us to think of social justice and who is left affected in this critical moment. And I suppose that makes the call to remind people that climate justice is racial justice. That if you care about racial justice, then you need to care about climate justice and vice versa. That those who have thought who are black and brown, that environmental concerns are elitist must be challenged. And those within the climate movement who have been a bit rarefied, frankly, and have often marginalized those who are at the front line of the fight against climate have to think again. And it's that I think makes ecocide necessary. Now, of course, it's necessary internationally. You just have to look at the burning of the world's lungs in Brazil to see the deep concern that we should have in relation to ecocide. But right across the world, in fact, this is not just an international policy, it's a domestic policy that countries can incorporate and begin to take on. And whether you are in Darfur, Chennai, whether you are polluted out of London, again, I remind you that in countries like the United States and the UK, who often lives in the most polluted environment, and what do they look like is a question that we need to ask. And when we understand that our biodiversity, 80% of it is in the custody of indigenous people, we rely on them so greatly, we have to come alongside them. So this moment, in a sense, is a critical moment. And when we look at the global architecture that we have, it's an architecture that was built after the Second World War. Genocide rampant in Europe, of course, fascism and communism, critical forces shaping the world, and democracy under attack. And that led to the Bretton Woods Agreement and much of the architecture that we rely on today. We are at such a critical moment today. And I suppose I am largely associated with social justice issues here in the UK. And I suppose I've been concerned that it's been left for international development experts to argue the case for why this is critical to black and brown people across the world. We now need to unite the fight. And I see ecocide as a major way in achieving that. So it's climate justice. It's not just about the climate emergency, as it were. And in that fight, it's a challenge, really, to the global community to get real about those indigenous people, to get real about those environments that are broken down, to get real about the balance between billionaire power and big business and corporates not meeting their obligations, and certainly state actors conspiring to put their interests before impoverished communities. And it's about giving them the support to stand up and to be accounted for. And we know that as we head to COP, this is a critical issue. It's an issue that's being raised by the Global South. It's an issue that's critical if you're serious about 1.5. It's an ethical that's critical if you're serious about nature loss and the solutions to equip us with that. And so for all of those reasons, I think the moment has come. I think this is a central debate and discussion. And I think that the arrival of the definition is timely, is appropriate, and now gives people something to rally around, to campaign on, and to challenge both their governments domestically and internationally with.
Thank you, David. Extremely in-depth kind of analysis there, I think, of the kind of historical reasons that have brought us to this point, and that give us the context for why this is the moment for this potential new crime. And I also love the way that you're talking about the, sort of kind of the reality check of this. And I think this is seriously a reality check moment that we're looking at, in the sense that, the voices of the indigenous, and actually even, of spiritual leaders such as Pope Francis, who's also got behind this.
That's right.
There's almost a kind of irony that those spiritual leaders are the ones that are pointing out the reality to us of, the fact that we are interconnected with the world around us, and that we have to, to take care and protect it for our own, thriving and survival. Whereas, perhaps the politicians, or many of them, obviously don't include the present company, have been a little bit laggard in kind of understanding that reality. And, you know, the continuation of our current trajectory is beginning to look a little bit like a flat earth attitude. One cannot, of course, continue to plunder a finite resource.
I mean, Jojo, just off the back of that, it's quite interesting to follow, obviously, what's happening in the United States and how that has shifted, of course, the global conversation. But whilst generally speaking, unfortunately, in these international fora, the United States is not the first to adopt international recognition and frameworks that can have a serious effect on its population. President Biden's Justice 40 initiative is a direct commitment to put 40% of his administration's climate and clean energy investments into the hands of disadvantaged communities. And it marks a really important turning point in the fight for justice. People like OCA fighting very hard for that, to mainstream these issues and to put squarely the issue of equity on the table. And if you're putting the issue of equity on the table, then you get to what are the mechanisms to protect that. And I think that gets us to ecocide. And of course, we've also got very important legal developments across the world. In the Netherlands, we've got Shell being ordered to align with the Paris Agreement. You've got Germany's highest court condemning Climate Protection Act for failing future generations. Progress in Paris, of course, with Macron signalling, at least domestically, ecocide framework. So there is some sense for optimism, and then we get the definition arrive, and the definition allows people to rally around something that you can look at and is tangible.
Absolutely. And Richard, maybe you could shed a bit of a light on, you know, what you think sort of key challenges might be in moving this forward.
Well, I think just following on from what David says, that there is a lot of good news around, actually, particularly in the climate litigation. But what worries me is that the worst climate criminals will be looking at those moves and thinking, our time is up, or it's going to be up very soon, within a decade. So we better grab as many resources as we can, as quickly as we can, irrespective of the damage it does to indigenous populations, the environment, and other people. So I think one important message that comes from a new ecocide law is that it would capture those types of people that are really intentionally destroying the environment for their own profit. So I think that's very important. Now, in terms of challenges, the greatest challenge really that was recognized by everyone on the panel is how to define the law that captures the offending conduct, but is not overbroad so that it scares off states. Because ultimately it's the states that need to vote this. We need 2/3 of states for it to be adopted as a new crime in the ICC. So that's a very difficult balance. And we dealt with that in a couple of ways. Firstly, we used a lot of very familiar language that we borrowed from the other international crimes or from environmental principles. So the severe, widespread, or long term is a phrase that's already used in war crimes and several other international treaties. And the definition of wanton, which allows the weighing of cost with harm, with cost with benefit, is really from principles of sustainable development. So the idea is to create a definition that's as familiar as possible to states, so it seems less frightening. Another challenge was to create a definition that remains relevant over time, because things are moving really fast, science and technology and politics, and what might seem wanton tomorrow may be different than what might seem wanton today, because that balance will change. What is clearly excessive, what's needed and legitimate, will seem different. If we look at, for example, coal 100 years ago, it was obviously needed because it fueled our economy and it allowed food to be moved and medicine to be moved and roads to be built. But it's no longer necessary because we have alternatives. So the weighing would be very different. And so the inclusion of the definition of wanton is important because it allows that definition to move with other advances in science and technology. And it's the same with unlawful. As states create greater protection for the environment, as they surely will, then more acts of destruction will fall under the definition of ecocide. So I mean, those are really the main challenges, is to get states on board and encourage them to vote for this as an international crime.
Thank you. And we'll start to have a little look at the questions that are coming in from the audience. And one thing that we've really noticed about this subject is it really triggers a lot of questions. And, you know, people are hugely interested in this sort of possibility for a very sort of concrete approach to dealing with environmental harm. One of the questions that's actually emerged in a couple of different forms is one that comes up a lot, which is, you know, would this law, can this law be retroactive? And you know, what is the you know, what are your thoughts around that? I mean, we have some quite strong thoughts around that from the foundation, in the sense that you know, we believe that, you know, while it can't be retroactive, but that's actually important because we need to be able to transition to a new approach to doing things. But one of the sort of related questions is, you know, are there some activities or situations going on globally now that, had this been in place, they could have been prevented? Would you have any thoughts around that, Richard? And I think David's nodding vigorously there as well.
Yeah, of course. Criminal laws generally, and international criminal laws in particular, they can't be retroactive. It's unfair, and they shouldn't be. And in some ways that's a shame when it comes to this subject, because of course most of the damage has already been caused by the wanton destruction that happened before. Global warming is obviously the most obvious, but perhaps the most complex example, because all the emissions that have gone up over the last 100 or so years are still there. And what's happening now is that people are just adding little drips to this vast pool of greenhouse gases. All those people that benefited from those causing those emissions, many of them became very rich off the back of it. Many of them, not all of them, many of them knew very well that they were causing damage in the long term. Almost all of them will get away with it. Many of them are dead, many of them are retired, but in any event, there won't be a retroactive application. Having said that, there are several examples of crimes where there's a continuing harm, where the acts that were started before a law is adopted are continuing after, or at least the harm is continuing after. And those, it can be complicated, but potentially those can be captured. But I do agree with you, Jojo, that there's also a need, but part of the rationale of having this law is to start influencing behavior. And we don't want loads of people to end up in prison. We want loads of people to change their behavior so they stop the damage. And so hopefully that is perhaps the most important advantage of an international crime, that it will send a message and change behavior. Companies will hopefully carry out much more rigorous environmental impact assessments. They will be much more cautious in terms of who they deal with, if those people are accused of environmental harm. And so hopefully it will change behavior. And that's probably the greatest benefit, particularly when it comes to international crimes, because of course the ICC only has so many resources, and it's not known for its efficiency. So it's unlikely to prosecute many ecocidaires anyway. We are hoping that this will change behaviour.
Absolutely. And David, you were nodding there. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
I was simply nodding to say that I think it would be very hard to make this retrospective, but to say that the changing environment is really important. And it goes back, I think some of that is actually, fun enough, already happening. The question is, could this really put a rocket under it? So, for example, I said before that 80% of the world's biodiversity is in the hands of indigenous people. It's also the case that that we now know that the fastest and cheapest ways to cut CO2 emissions is to restore and protect that biodiversity. And in a sense, with the huge nature and rewilding movement that's taking place now across the world, this shores that up. And can perhaps halt some of the destruction and the devastation that we're seeing. So I do think that we should see the new definition not just as an enforcement vehicle, but as a sort of coercive vehicle that shifts behavior.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting to contrast, those who've been campaigning for human rights and social justice, have at least had the kind of foundational knowledge that mass murder and torture are criminal. Of course, those campaigning, or, those working in conservation or campaigning to protect ecosystems have not had that, because, a sort of hard stop at a foundational level like this has simply not been in place. And so, all of those campaigners, all of those experts and scientists and so on have kind of been operating in over a sort of a void that potentially this law could fill and actually create a sort of solid foundation. I mean, one of the things that we've found interesting is that some people see this as a stick, in terms of it's an enforceable deterrent, it's a thou shalt not, and others, and we actually see both sides of this. Others also, actually, this is a carrot, because what it's doing is encouraging all of those who are, from activists on the ground reporting situations, from communities that are suffering at the sharp end of ecocidal activities, but to academics, to scientists, to NGOs who are all working on improving the knowledge around effects that we have on the environment and around the regulations that should be in place, will all be supported and effectively encouraged and kind of pulled forward by this definition, not least because of the reasons that Richard was giving around the fact that it will continue to be relevant as time goes on and as those regulations improve, which in itself is a kind of spur to improving them. And I think also there's an element of giving a level of seriousness to the body of environmental law that it currently doesn't have in comparison to, say, law around people and property. I mean, the whole body of environmental law is relatively new, sort of 3-4 decades. And one of the issues that we hear about a lot from, people getting in touch with us around ecocide is saying that, but there are laws, they're just not being enforced, or they're not being, all that's happening is, a slap on the wrist and a fine. And so there's a way in which creating this sort of bottom line of criminality that could potentially majorly shift that, we hope. So let's look at a couple more of the questions coming in. Here's one actually for David that seems to be very popular. Obviously, the Labour Party may not have yet taken a position on this as a whole, but would you personally welcome different constituencies potentially putting in a motion to conference in support of an international law of ecocide?
Yes, I mean, I think that we need this debated on the conference floor. I mean, I've been very clear that I find the ecocide development very attractive. The Labour Party is a party that has traditionally wanted to stand with marginal people. It's a party that doesn't just understand equality, it understands equity and repair. And so that I would think it was very strange, frankly, if at a progressive conference like the Labour Party conference, this were not something for debate and wider discussion. So I certainly, if you like, as the custodian of what is legal, as it were, I'm very, very keen. It will obviously be for those that lead on for us on environmental policy, and that's primarily Ed Miliband, to also take a view, and colleagues like Lisa Nandy, because this does affect international relationships, to have a review on this. But legally, I'm really clear. This is a no-brainer. We need it.
Fantastic. A related questions come in actually around, what is the situation with national British law around this? And it's interesting to note, and again, I know that the Labour Party hasn't yet taken a position on this, but just as a point of information for our watchers and listeners, there has been an amendment submitted to the Environment Bill, which is currently going through the House of Lords, and I'm just wondering if I can find it and share my screen so that you can see that, because that's really quite an exciting development. So let's see, can you see that? So there's this 287 here, an international crime of ecocide. This has been introduced by Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle, Natalie Bennett, former Green Party leader. It is an objective of Her Majesty's government to support the negotiation of an amendment to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to establish a crime of ecocide. And it goes on to suggest that either independently or with other countries, that the UK government submit a proposal for this. And the very simple explanation of ecocide there is it tallies quite closely with the definition that's just emerged, so severe and either widespread or long term. So that's really exciting in the sense that it's the first time that in a UK government bill this legal concept has been set out very specifically. Obviously we won't know till that's discussed how what the response is to that, and how that emerges in terms of the House of Lords and then later return to the Commons. But what we would certainly say from our perspective is that this could actually be a really easy political win for the government in the UK, because one of the reasons that we aim for supporting an international law of ecocide, it is precisely because to sort of step out on a limb and to be the first on the block to legislate for ecocide is scary for governments. They don't want to sort of legislate overnight and create some kind of chaos or that they believe will happen. But having some time to see this coming is something that almost is automatically going to be the case when you're approaching at the international level, because it takes time to gain the support of enough member states to move this forward and so on. But it also kind of puts it on the table, so it's a kind of low risk political direction to go in, because you get to look like the leader that you need to look like if you're about to host COP26, I have to say, and actually put some political will in the right direction, while knowing that many other countries also have to move with you for this to happen. But at the same time, I mean, I don't know what you think about this, Richard, but it seems to me that this definition could potentially also be approached by individual jurisdictions, and perhaps they might, if they were interested in using this definition, they could potentially look at creating a transition or a phasing in period for it. But it could also be compatible with national approaches. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. No one's expecting the member states of the ICC to adopt this very quickly. It's going to take several years, probably, unfortunately. But in the meantime, those states who are very supportive of it could simply adopt new national crimes of ecocide. And I think that would send a really important message to other states. And of course, the more that the activists put pressure on their own governments, the more governments may feel that they have to adopt a law on ecocide. And that will be a great start. And of course, it can sort of snowball in that way. So absolutely, I know that several states are looking at new crimes of ecocide, Belgium, France, etc. And surely that will only that movement will only progress as time goes on. So it can be used nationally, it should be used nationally, and I think that will help add to the pressure for it to become an international crime as well.
And on a more specific level, we've got a question that I think probably a lot of people might be harboring in their minds, which is that could investment in fossil fuels, knowing what damage that may cause, could that be classed as a wanton crime?
It must be definitely the case that domestically there may be circumstances in which that were in scope. It would depend on the circumstances. I know that there's controversy at the moment in the UK about remining for fossil fuels. In the country that my family historically are from, Guyana, there is also controversy at the biggest oil find in a generation offshore, which is now coming out of the ground by virtue of the drilling of ExxonMobil, and it's causing controversy. And there's an action now before the courts about whether that is in the interests of the people of Guyana and in the interests of a country that sits at the top of the Amazon basin and produces, the Guyana Shield produces 11% of the world's fresh water. You can imagine, if there were an oil spill, the significance of that, not just in the region, but globally. And so we do need to turn away from dirty fossil fuels to a different future. And we need to start getting serious about how we do that and what that is. And that's not just about the chat and the targets that then get missed sometimes, whether it's Paris or indeed COP coming up. It's got to be, as it's always been in the international order, which is through laws that are binding and that can be challenged before a court of law.
We've got another question here that perhaps might be one for you, Richard, is how does this definition differ, and why is it better potentially than maybe working definitions that have been present in the past?
Well, there were so many, or there were several, so I don't want to go into too much sort of technical detail, but I think it's different in a number of respects. One is that it's less reliant on science, certainly than a definition that came out in France, and that was a great definition. But the problem with that is that international criminal judges would not be in a position to make an assessment of the facts if it's too scientific. And the other aspect is that I think it relies much more heavily on accepted international criminal law language or accepted environmental law principles. And as I mentioned before, we intentionally try to stay as close as possible to familiar language and familiar principles, because those will be much easier to sell to the states. And so I think that it differs in those two respects. It's if you read it, obviously there's several novel aspects to it in terms of international criminal law, but ultimately most of it is adapted from other treaties or other laws that states have either accepted or are very familiar with. And in many cases, the judges have already adjudicated on several of these terms. So I think that's the major difference.
Thank you. We've also had a question around the relationship between ecocide and rights of nature. And I mean, touched on this a little bit earlier. Certainly from our perspective, we see this as a kind of complementary situation in the sense that the rights of nature is looking at who has sort of legal personhood, and there are, of course, there's a big rights of nature movement globally, and certain landscape features in various countries have been given legal rights, but as a whole, as I understand it, the legal system is largely anthropocentric, and to shift that completely, so that nature has its own standing in and of itself, is quite a major shift for the legal system to take. And ecocide crime, kind of by comparison, almost is a sort of strategic intervention that can slot in as an additional crime in a list that is kind of already in existence. And the relationship of the criminal law to the rights law is a kind of relationship of protection and of complementarity. And I suppose, the whole discourse around human rights is actually, and potentially in the future by extension of nature rights, is relatively new compared to the concept of criminal law, if I understand it correctly. I mean, murder has obviously been a crime for many, many centuries before human rights was a conversation. So one of the things that we find interesting about that is that ecocide as a crime can act almost as a kind of a bit of a bridging piece. It's pushing the boat out a bit in terms of what Richard was talking about earlier, in terms of moving towards addressing damage to nature per se, and that has the potential, we believe, to kind of open up, in a simple and sort of initial way, that the whole kind of arena of law to be thinking differently about the natural world and our place in it. So that's a really a kind of interesting complementarity, and I think it's probably worth just in the last few minutes just asking each of you whether you have any kind of closing thoughts around the potential of this crime, around your what you would personally want to see happen next, and perhaps, yeah, I mean, I'd love to sort of hear your current kind of personal conclusions or feelings around this development, this milestone that the definition has been coming out. So maybe if we start with Richard and go on to David.
Well, I think it's incredibly exciting, and I think we're in a very different place than we were even 2 or 3 years ago. There's a much greater consciousness generally about what we're facing, because we can see it all around us now. It's climate change and biodiversity loss is not something that is in the distant future. It's here and now, and even the pandemic sent a very strong message that something needs to be done. So I'm very optimistic, actually, that many states will get behind this, and those that don't will increasingly look like they're behind the times, and at some point they'll look like pariah states. So I think it's very exciting.
And look, and can I just say that, in a sense, I come to this personally, and it's to begin where I started, that if you're serious about Black Lives Matter, if you're serious about climate justice, then this is the natural conclusion of what we now need in a new global order. Clearly, there were missteps and problems, if you like, with the implementation of Paris. We need stronger arsenal globally, and this is part of that story. And then I think of some of our small island states who are really, again, struggling with the climate emergency. And it's really interesting to see countries like Vanuatu, hardly mentioned, but asking for this at the European Union. And I know, because I've got obviously lots of relationships in the Caribbean, that the Caribbean islands hugely concerned about what's happening and their futures. which makes this really important. And you remind you, in the country of my parents' birth, the discovery of oil, wanting to protect indigenous people, this is critical. And then back here in the UK, I mean, I'm a bit less optimistic, I've got to tell you, Jojo, about this government. This is a government that's stepped back from our international agreement on aid at a critical time for the world, extraordinarily. And I think that there's a lot of chat and rhetoric in relation to COP, but the delivery and the ambition is not quite there in the way it needs to be. I hope that this is a prompt to take up that challenge. Let's see.
I very much hope so too. I really hope you're right. I really feel like this is an opportunity that Boris shouldn't be missing. And he will be missing a trick if he doesn't take up this conversation, because this is a conversation that is only set to grow. And in closing, I'll just take a last question from the chat here, which is, how can we help? What can individuals do to support this going forward? And first and foremost, we would certainly say go and have a look at our website, stopecocide.earth, where there's an Act Now section with a whole list of things that you can do to support this. But first and foremost, it's really about a conversation. There is something about this word, about the word ecocide, that encapsulates the damage that we can see happening in so many areas of the natural world. And so having a word that draws all of that together, as this is all serious damage and destruction, it has a way of kind of bringing those thoughts together and at the same time creating a kind of moral response, which is, well, that's wrong and should be stopped. And so there's a kind of internal momentum to it. And what we've seen, just from our experience and from the numbers, what we've seen is that where people are having those conversations on the ground, in their language, in their culture, in their particular sector, it does make a difference at the political level. And we're seeing that quite directly, that where those conversations are happening is also where the political world is starting to sit up and take notice. So whatever else you do about this, talk about it. Talk about ecocide in your own networks and spread the word, literally the word ecocide, as widely and as loudly as you can. And with that, I'd like to thank Richard Rogers and David Lammy both very much, very warmly, for being here with us today. And thank you to all our attendees. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you around developments on this really, really exciting legal development. Thank you, everybody.